Hi, this is Joe Chambers. Welcome to Musicians Hall of Fame Backstage. Today's clip is part 3 of a 4-part interview we did with my good friend and great musician, John Jorgenson. John talks about how he became part of the Desert Rose Band and how that band came to be. Talks about some of his guitars. Matter of fact, his signature model guitars from Fender and G&L. The Helicaster model guitar, which was from a band that he played with called the Helicasters. And also his Sparkle G&L that he's really known for playing with the Desert Rose Band. Hope you enjoy it. If you do, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new content. Again, John Jorgenson. Welcome back to Musicians Hall of Fame Backstage with John Jorgenson. So, tell me about Desert Rose Band. How did that come about?
Okay, yeah. I met Bill Bryson, who had played bass in Country Gazette with Roland White, and he had also been part of the Bluegrass Cardinals. He wrote the great song "Girl at the Crossroads Bar." He wrote "Riding on the L&N." He's just a great guy. And then Bill started playing with Chris Hillman. And in Chris's band was Al Perkins and Bernie Ledden. And they were an acoustic quartet. And at some point, Bernie decided he didn't want to do that anymore and he wanted to move to Nashville. And so he had been living in California. So there was a spot open in Chris's quartet. And Bill recommended me. And then around the same time, I went to the NAMM show, the January NAMM show also in Anaheim.
Right.
And David Grissman was there. He was presenting a mandolin, a signature model mandolin that the Saga company had made. It was a copy of his Monteleone mandolin. Okay. So he's there, sitting there, and I had never met him at this point, but I was a fan. And I was there with a Django style guitar. And I said, hey, if you have to sit here and demonstrate this mandolin, do you want to jam? And he was like, yeah, of course I do. So we started jamming Limehouse Blues and Sweet Georgia Brown and, minor swing and whatever. And while we were playing, Chris Hillman and Al Perkins walk up. And what better credibility could I have than be jamming with David Grissman? They didn't know. I just met him seconds ago.
Right, yeah.
But, he'd already heard my name. Now he sees me playing with Grissman. And then shortly after that, he said, look, I've got a spot, open in my band. Come up and we'll play together and see if it works out. And, he loved Jess McReynolds too. So the fact that I could cross-pick like Jesse, he liked that. And Chris at the time would switch back and forth between mandolin and guitar. So I could do the same thing. So if he wanted to play, mandolin, I'd play guitar. And so I played with him. We did a couple of tours, and we played in Europe, and it was nice. It was a good sounding quartet. Then he got the chance to open for Dan Fogelberg and back him up when he was promoting his album High Country Snows. Well, Chris wanted Herb in that group for his banjo playing and his singing. So Herb came and replaced Al. So now it's Chris, Herb Peterson, myself, and Bill Bryson. Basically 2/3 of what would be the Desert Rose Band. During this time, the songs that Chris was bringing in, that he was writing, I really liked them. But I said, Chris, these really need drums and electric guitar and pedal steel. And he was like, no, I don't want to do that. He'd been through all these other bands by that time. The Byrds, Flying Burrito Brothers, Manassas, McGuinn Clark Hillman, Southern Hillman Furay, blah, blah. He's just like, no, I'm just happy doing this acoustic thing. I said, okay. So then my next step is I had a little home studio and I made some demos of what I heard in my mind, which was like a combination of the kind of guitar sounds from Britain, like the Pretenders, but vocals like Bill Monroe,
Yeah, yeah.
And so he heard these and went, oh, okay, I see what you're talking about. So then we tried, we we brought in a drummer and a steel player and tried a couple of shows as a 6-piece band. And the second one, they weren't the right guys.
Mm-hmm.
And in the break, I was walking up to him to say, you know what, if you like this, please have it with my blessing. I don't like it. And before the words came out of my mouth, he said, this is not happening, is it? I said, no, it's not. I said, I know the guys. It's got to be Steve Duncan and J.D. Maness. And Steve, I had already played with. I had a band called the Cheatin' Hearts, which was Bill Bryson, Steve Duncan, Sneaky Pete on pedal steel, Bob Moore's now wife, Kitra, who had not met him yet at that time. She was one of the singers. I was one of the singers. And then we had another guy named Bob Knight on acoustic rhythm and vocals. And Kitra and Bob and I sang the 3-part harmony, and Sneaky and Bill and Steve were the rhythm section. So I already knew, I knew Sneaky was not the right player for this band, but I knew JD was. So by that time, Kitra had met Bob Moore and moved to Nashville, wasn't part of that band anymore. The band kind of fell apart. But I had a gig still booked for that band, and I had to have something to take. So I hired Bill, Steve, JD, Chris, and myself, and I gave them tapes of Chris's songs so they knew what they sounded like, so he could hear what the band would sound like. And so he went, okay, I see where you're going with this. And so literally, I think the second gig that we played with the final lineup was at the Palomino in North Hollywood. And there was somebody from Curb Records, Dick Whitehouse was there. Yeah. It was during ACM time, so there was a lot of country music business people around Southern California. And we got signed to our deal then from that gig. So
it just happened.
Well, as Chris, Chris just had a book come out called Time Between last year, and he describes me as relentless with this idea. And I guess I was. I just heard it in my mind. And then I was really happy that when country radio heard it, they liked it too. They could hear that it was a fresh sound. We were obviously steeped in the tradition of country music, but we weren't a slave to it. There was some new energy and new sounds. But having, Steve Duncan, who had been part of Rick Nelson's Stone Canyon Band, an early proponent of country rock, and J.D. Maness, who had replaced Tom Brumley in Buck Owens' Buckaroos, and Herb Peterson.
You eventually had Tom too, right?
Well, yeah. Tom came and joined the Desert Rose Band after J.D. left.
Yeah.
So J.D. replaced him in the Buckaroos.
Yeah.
He replaced J.D. in the Desert Rose Band. And Herb had been in the Dillards, and sang with Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris and all that. So, in Chris's history, I was the only one really without a pedigree at that point. But it was
you look cool too. So that's another thing. Y'all's videos were really good. I thought.
I think so too. I think they were pretty cool.
And the guitars y'all played looked so cool as well. I mean, for guitar players, And
well, I grew up, just lusting after everything that I thought was cool. Of course, Fenders and Gibsons and Rickenbackers and Gretches and Dan Electros and so. Since I was the person in that band that could change the color of the sound, so I ended up bringing a lot of those sounds into it. At that point, nobody in country music was using a Rickenbacker 12-string.
Right.
But I wanted to bring that from Chris's history.
Right.
And really, own that.
Yeah. And it worked. It worked great.
And then the 6-string bass, I was loving the way that sounded on some records like Dave Edmunds, how he was using it. I thought that could be cool, so I kind of brought that back into it. And I remember the first day that I rolled my Vox AC30 into the studio to record the first album. Ed C. was our engineer. And he said, "Is that a British Vox AC30?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've always wanted to record one of those." And I'm like, okay, instantly, this is my guy. And he was into it. And he got some of the best sounds,
Yeah.
I think, for me that I ever
Yeah.
recorded. To the point where Brad Paisley, who became a fan later and really loved my guitar sound,
Right.
he bought the amps, the closest that he could get, and he figured out what kind of guitars I was using. And then I think when he came time for him to do his first album, he tracked down Ed C. and asked him, "Okay, what mics did you put on
No
Jorgenson's
kidding. Wow.
amp, and where did you put them?" And,
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, I thought, because Ed's he's a treasure, man. He's done so much of the cool stuff in Atlanta, Paul Davis and the brick stuff, and I think he worked with Nigel Olsson down there. And anyway, that's a whole other side.
How'd you go about, briefly, how did you get your G&L and Fender deal with? I mean, that's another great honor to have guitars with your name on them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so at this time, when the Desert Rose Band was starting, I lived in Anaheim. Fullerton is the next town over.
Mm-hmm.
That's where Fender came from, and that's where G&L came from.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my good buddies, a guitarist named Jeff Ross, he was like the guy that knew everything. He was a little bit older than me. He brought me into bands in LA. He brought me to see people, introduced me to lots of players. He's the one who introduced me to Peter Green and to Alan Holdsworth and to Jimmy Bryant and Danny Gatton. He's Roy Buchanan.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't easy to find those players in those days. They weren't on hit records necessarily.
Yeah,
You had to find them.
I was a huge Holdsworth fan. He was, jazz don't sell a lot of records,
Yeah. So Jeff also was great at doing all the pedal steel bends and stuff on the guitar. I stole all that from him. We had a rockabilly band together for a couple of years back at that time. I played the upright bass. He was the guitar player. And I was, watching all the guitar shit that he did.
Mm-hmm.
So, in fact, I was substituting for him. He was substituting for Johnny Meeks in a band of Kitras. He couldn't do it. He recommended me, and I was subbing for him. And the drummer, that's when I met Steve Duncan. So who I'd already seen him play with Rick Nelson, but I'd never played with him. So anyway, Jeff knew Leo Fender well,
Mm-hmm.
and to the point where Leo Fender would really want his opinion,
Yeah.
because Jeff would tell him the truth.
Right.
He brought him a guitar that they were so proud of, and all of the brass, George Fullerton and Dale Hyatt, they're all here at the club where Jeff's playing.
Right.
And he comes to the table and they say, "Well, what do you think?" He says, "I hate it. This is a terrible guitar."
Yeah.
And they were all like, "You can't tell the emperor he doesn't have any clothes on."
Right.
So, so I think that was sort of the impetus of Leo Fender designing the ASAT. Jeff kind of pushed that through.
Mm-hmm.
So when that guitar came out, it was shortly called the Broadcaster again,
Mm-hmm.
before they changed it to the ASAT. Well, Jeff took me to G&L and introduced me to them and said, "This is my friend. He's starting to do pretty well. You might like your guitars." And so he got me in with them. And they gave me an ASAT to play. And I carried it around on tour for a while. And I played in soundcheck and I really liked it. And then, but I would always be afraid, when I get in the gig, I'll wish that I had my Telecaster again.
Right.
Well, eventually I just tried it on the gig and it just sounded so good. It sounded amazing. And that's the guitar. I ended up playing it on Austin City Limits. And through a whole other series of events, Brad Paisley's record company wanted to give him a gift that he would really like, so they asked his tech, what would he want? And it was Zach Charles at the time, and Zach said he would want one of John Jorgenson's ASATs from Desert Rose Band. So they called me and they said, could you, you know, do you have one that you would, you know, give to him? And I thought, by this time I had convinced them to paint me a sparkle one.
Yeah.
Because I'd gone to see Billy Zoom with X, and Billy played a Gretsch Silverjet.
Yeah.
And it looked so great under the lights.
Right.
I went, okay, I got to have a sparkle. And most people think it was from Buck Owens, but I hadn't seen Buck's sparkly one at that point.
Yours is different anyway.
So and when I asked them, they said, no, we don't want to do that. I said, oh, come on, please. They said, no, we won't do it. I said, why? He said, because a little flake is going to get stuck in our ducting system, and it's going to come down and land in the middle of a black finish and ruin it. I went, okay, I guess they've done this before.
Yeah.
So, but finally they did. And I loved that sparkly guitar, so that became my main one.
That's a great looking guitar.
And before that, so the one that I was playing on Austin City Limits, it was it was a natural finish. It was nothing flashy about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, this one, you know, I'm not attached to this one. So I brought it to the presentation, and Zach saw it, and his eyes lit up. He says, that's the one from Austin City Limits. He said, we watched that tape over and over, and Brad's going to lose his mind. That's the one. He's going to know exactly. And of course, he did as well immediately. So anyway, that's where that one is. And then I became identified with the sparkly one, and it was in the video of She Don't Love Nobody, and I just loved the guitar. And so it was a number of years later, they asked me what I like to do with signature model guitar, and I said, yes, I would love that. So they had changed a lot of things about that model by the time, you know, this was maybe 1995, and I was just starting to tour with Elton John.
Mm-hmm.
And so they copied all of the details of that guitar. And I was about to go on my first big tour, and they hadn't, by this time, Leo had passed away, and the company was owned now by BBE. And I don't want to, nothing negative about BBE, but I had to call them and say, you know, I'm about to go on a big world tour, and you've built a signature guitar for me. Don't you think it'd be a good idea if I had one to play on this tour?
Yeah.
And they went, we didn't send you one? I said, no.
Well.
So they sent one, and I got to play it on tour. But I never had the relationship with that company like I had with Mr. Fender.
Yeah.
And Dale Hyatt and George Fullerton.
Yeah.
Those guys, they were really great. And you know, Leo also would give me prototype guitars and say, what do you think? You know, and I would have to be honest, you know, and say, you know, and I said,
He liked that though. I've heard that from other players.
Yeah,
you know.
he said, I said,
Burton
well,
said the same thing.
I like this one. Why? I said, well, it just has a better sound. Why?
Yeah.
I said, well, maybe because of these switches. Why? You know, it was like,
Yeah.
so that never happened with BBE.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know why. Just, you know, so at that time, by that time, I'd started the Helicasters with Jerry Donahue and Will Ray.
Right.
And Jerry had been a Fender endorser for a long time. And he kept like, come on, you guys, you got to come to Fender. And I would be like, no, I'm with G&L, I'm happy with that. And Will Ray was also, you know, I'd introduced him to them. Well, finally, it just kind of fell apart at G&L, and by this time, Fender was very motivated, you know, to have all three Helicasters. And so they said we would like to do a limited edition set. The only other band that we've done that for is the Ventures. And so immediately we liked this idea. And they said, you can do whatever you want, you know, design your guitars however you like. And so in a strange turnabout, one of the guitars that I was using with the Helicasters was this prototype of a Comanche model that Leo Fender had given me. And he'd given me 3 of them. And I took them out to play on a gig with Dale Watson in a little honky-tonk. And one of them I just loved. I said, please, can I just have this one? I don't want one like it. I want this one.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have finish on it. It had no logo.
Mm-hmm.
It looked like you made it in your garage.
Right,
you know?
yeah.
And they said, sure. So I recorded some of the first Helicasters album on that guitar. Now, I need what that does. A certain type of vibrato, certain type of pickups. Leo had designed pickups very much like his P-bass.
Mm-hmm.
2 half coils that humbuck each other.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things added up to create this particular sound. So I then designed my Helicaster signature limited edition Fender to replicate what the G&L
Yeah.
had done. So I sent the guitar to Seymour Duncan. I said, can you copy these pickups but make them look like Fender pickups,
Yeah.
and use Alnico magnets instead of ceramic, which give a nicer tone to me. And then all the other elements I copied. It was a maple body, real heavy, 2-point vibrato. I put a left-handed headstock on it just
Yeah.
because it was cool. And so, you know, here was Leo Fender creating something a little bit like his original Stratocaster, but different. And then I took that and had Fender take it back into a Fender world.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be called a Helicaster instead of a Stratocaster or anything else. And their trademark department didn't want to do that, but I kind of pushed, and finally they did. So it says Fender Helicaster, and then they put the cool little Helicasters logo inlaid into it, and that's and you have one of the first. Well, we got the first 3 of those each, and so you have one of those hanging here in the museum,
Yeah.
next to one of the signature G&L.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of sparkle on those guitars, but they have a very unique sound, and they were only built for a year, a limited edition, 1 year of. So I think there's like 400 of those. And
I sold a few of them in my guitar shop.
Did you?
Yeah, sure did.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well,
Hey, we're going to take a break, and when we
Okay.
come back, I'm going to talk about Elton John.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
We'll be right back.